The service had scarcely begun when Mrs. Gudgeon shrieked, a short, shocked peep, not unlike the cry of someone discovering a dead sparrow in her trifle. It came from the front pew of Flaxborough's St. Ethelburga's, and it was enough to jolt the entire congregation from their verses. Her gaze was fixed on the choir stalls. There, slumped awkwardly across the second bench like a dropped cassock, lay young Edwin Tudge, junior chorister, habitual sniffer, and possessor of the most erratic falsetto in recent church memory. His arms dangled over the hymnals like a discarded marionette. Reverend Peeling, having just announced hymn 142, took a solemn step forward, only to halt at the disquieted whisper spreading like smoke through the pews. "He's fainted. Just sleeping. They always do, poor mites. He's dead, I tell you. Look at his ears. Blue. Not dead, just acting. That boy's always trying it on. Where's his hymnal? They always have one. Always. Maybe that's what killed him." A heavy hymn dropped on his poor little head. The Reverend, adjusting his spectacles, motioned subtly to the verger, who approached with the steady calm of a man more familiar with misplaced offertory plates than collapsed choir boys. Moments later, with the utmost decorum, young Edwin was declared very much alive, though dazed, pale, and, to the verger's dismay, smelling faintly of something not entirely ecclesiastical. He was escorted out, blinking and murmuring about a funny cupboard and numbers missing. The congregation exhaled in unison, but not entirely in relief. Inspector Purbright, present not for divine reflection, but under his wife's firm ecclesiastical insistence, had already risen halfway from his seat before settling again with a thoughtful expression. His eyes lingered on the hymn board. The numbers read 142, 98, 305, 76. Nothing seemed out of order, except, yes, the 305 was reversed, the metal numeral dangling at an angle. Barely perceptible, but notable. He leaned toward Sergeant Love, who was hunched forward with boyish concern. "That boy didn't fall asleep," Purbright murmured. "He went looking." "Looking, sir?" Love straightened. "For what?" "A hymnal, one presumes, and perhaps found something else." They said nothing more until the final benediction. But the undercurrent had shifted. Flaxborough's Sunday calm, usually as predictable as overboiled cabbage, now prickled with unease. By the church gates, gossip had burst into full bloom. "Mrs. Glastonbury says he was poisoned, always said that choir wine tasted odd." "No poison. It was one of those fainting spells. His mother has a weak constitution too. Runs in the legs." "Don't be daft. That boy went snooping. Bet he found something under the altar. They've been hiding things there since the Puritans." "I heard it was that new curate, always scribbling in his notebook. Never trust a man with hair that shiny. They say Edwin saw a ghost. Poor thing turned white as linen." Purbright, standing quietly by the wrought iron gate, observed them in turn, his eyes resting for a moment on the stone steps, then flicking toward the vestry door. "Odd," he murmured. "One would expect a hymnal to be present." Sergeant Love followed his gaze. "You mean he lost it?" "Possibly. Or perhaps it was never there to begin with." Inside the vestry, the Reverend Peeling was wringing his hands over the register book. "A frightful thing, Inspector. The boy claims to have seen something. Says someone was already in the vestry cupboard before the service. Utter nonsense, of course. I keep the keys on me at all times." "Could we have a look?" Purbright asked mildly. Peeling obliged, unlocking the squat wooden cupboard. It contained the usual: candle oil, unused hymnals, robes folded with the crisp reverence of a dry cleaner's apprentice. But no sign of anything amiss, unless one counted the absence of one small green-bound hymnal marked number 7. Love made a note. "Gone missing, has it?" "Occasionally they're mislaid," Peeling offered, less certainly. "But not during service. That's rather peculiar." "Indeed," Purbright nodded. Tell me, Reverend, when was the last time hymn 305 was sung? Peeling blinked. 305? Why, not for months. I didn't even select it. The board numbers are changed by Mr. Coggins. He's rather zealous about the tradition. Coggins, Purbright repeated thoughtfully. The verger. A pause. Then Purbright's dry voice again, half to himself. Fainting choir boys, rearranged hymn numbers, and missing books. This promises to be a very musical week. Just then, a breathless churchwarden arrived at the door. Inspector, you'll want to see this, she huffed. We've just found something behind the organ, folded paper. Looks old, but it's in young Edwin's handwriting. Purbright accepted the paper without a word, unfolding it. A scrawl, done in pencil, clearly hurried. Saw man inside cupboard. Didn't look like the vicar. He dropped the hymn. Beneath it, a crude drawing of the hymn board, with a circle around number 305. Purbright folded it back and slipped it into his pocket. Well then, he said with a quiet sigh, let's see where this tune takes us. By the time Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love stepped out of the vestry and into the churchyard, the news had thoroughly metastasized. What began as a fainting spell had now blossomed among the laurel bushes and between the iron grave markers into tales of ghosts, secret liaisons, and ancient curses. There's a woman swears she saw a man vanish through the vestry wall, murmured Love, glancing back at a knot of parishioners gathered near the lych gate. Says it were like something from the Book of Revelation. Purbright, who had little time for dramatic apocalyptic interpretations, walked on in silence. He was digesting Edwin's drawing with the kind of mild detachment usually reserved for train timetables or municipal budgets. The crude rendering of the hymn board, circled and labelled, pointed to deliberate mischief. But mischief, in Flaxborough, rarely came without motive. "Did you notice?" he said at last. The boy drew the man's face without any detail. Love frowned. Couldn't see it, maybe. Or forgot it. Or never saw it properly, Purbright replied, because whoever it was took great care not to be seen. They paused at the rectory gate. Reverend Peeling had returned to console Mrs. Gudgeon, who was describing her hysterical palpitations with increasing theatrical detail and gestures that would have alarmed a lesser man of the cloth. "Let's have a word with Mr. Coggins," Purbright said, "and then a look at the hymn board itself." They found the verger in the church hall, polishing brass with the zealous serenity of a man whose entire sense of purpose depended on shine. He looked up, startled but flattered, when the inspector addressed him. "Oh, yes, sir. I do the board every Saturday evening. Always have, since '97. Never missed a service, save that week I had shingles." "Did you place hymn 305 on the board this week?" "Certainly not, sir. I put the numbers as written in the vicar's list. It were 142, 98, 176, and 76. No 305 in that lot." "Are you sure?" "As sure as I am of me own name. I always check twice, same as checking the wicks and font levels." Love chimed in. "Then how did 305 end up there?" Coggins rubbed his jaw with his polishing rag. "I suppose someone must have changed it after me. But why would anyone do a thing like that?" Purbright offered no answer, only asked to see the storage cupboard where the numbers were kept. Coggins led them into a side room behind the altar, bare stone, low ceiling, and a lingering smell of beeswax and stale flowers. Inside, a tin box held a tidy row of numbered cards, their black lettering bold against aged cream backgrounds. Number 305 was missing. "Interesting," Purbright murmured. "Mr. Coggins, when did you last notice the full set was present?" "Oh, well, not since last week. But no one ever goes in here except me and the vicar." Purbright's gaze flicked to the cupboard's lock, old, stiff, with a scratch mark beneath the latch. He touched it lightly. "Has this been forced?" Coggins stepped forward, startled. No, not to my knowledge." "Sergeant, make a note of that, and ask the Reverend later if anyone else has had access." Love scribbled in his pad, his brow furrowed with effort. "Shall we speak with the boy now?" Purbright hesitated. "Soon. But first I'd like to know why hymn 305 matters." Back in the rectory, a heavy green-bound hymnal sat untouched on a side table. Purbright picked it up and turned to the index. Hymn 305, "Let not the watchman sleep." He read the lyrics silently. The hymn spoke of vigilance, of hidden danger, and the duty to guard what is sacred. Rather weighty stuff for a boy like Edwin to circle. Symbolic, perhaps, Purbright mused aloud. Or a warning, Love offered. Like someone telling someone to keep quiet. Purbright closed the book slowly. It's also possible Edwin didn't choose the number at all. Love looked puzzled. You think someone else did? Perhaps. Or perhaps the hymn number changed hands, much like the hymnal itself. He tapped the side of the book thoughtfully, then asked, "Do we know where Edwin got his hymnal that morning?" The vicar, when summoned again, admitted he did not personally hand out books to the boys. That duty belonged to Miss Fortescue, the choir master's sister, an unmarried woman of formidable height and neatly pinned grey curls. Miss Fortescue was not difficult to find. She stood at the foot of the church hall garden, instructing a group of children on proper post-service comportment, which appeared to involve balancing books on their heads. She acknowledged the inspector with a dignified tilt of the chin. "Edwin, yes, I gave him his usual hymnal. Number 7. He always has number 7. Was it in its place?" "I believe so." Purbright adjusted his stance. "And where is number 7 now?" Miss Fortescue blinked. "Why, I imagine it's still in the stalls." "It isn't." She pursed her lips. "Then one of the others must have taken it. Boys do swap books sometimes, though I strongly discourage it." "And would it be possible," Purbright asked gently, "for someone to have taken Edwin's hymnal before he arrived?" A pause, followed by a reluctant nod. "If they were early, yes." "Thank you," Purbright said. "That will be all for now." As they walked back across the gravel path, Love voiced the thought aloud. "So someone came early, swapped the hymnal, and fiddled with the board." "Possibly," said Purbright. "And if so, we must ask ourselves why they wanted Edwin to find that hymn number and not his usual book." Love looked suddenly alert. "Sir, what if the hymn wasn't the point at all?" Purbright smiled faintly. "Now you're asking the right questions." Behind them, a voice called out. It was the Reverend, holding something up. "Inspector, I've just remembered. We keep a spare register of borrowed hymnals. Edwin's number 7 was already marked out at 8:15 this morning." Purbright's eyes narrowed, and the service began at 10. He turned slowly to Love. "Let's go speak to the boy." Edwin Tudge sat hunched on a folding chair in the sacristy, swinging his feet just above the tiled floor. A chipped mug of warm barley water sat untouched on the table beside him. His choir robe had been removed and replaced by a mustard-colored jumper several sizes too large, which seemed to have swallowed his neck entirely. He looked up as Inspector Purbright entered, his eyes wary but curious. "I didn't mean to cause a fuss," he said at once, voice hoarse from embarrassment and the residual fumes of whatever he'd inhaled behind the organ. "You caused a necessary one," Purbright said gently. "We'd simply like to understand it." Sergeant Love took up a station near the doorway, notebook ready, while Purbright drew up a chair and sat opposite the boy. "You said you saw someone in the cupboard." Edwin nodded. "Just for a second. I wasn't meant to be there, see. Miss Fortescue would tell me off something dreadful, but I dropped my cough sweet and it rolled near the vestry. That's when I noticed the door wasn't shut proper." Purbright leaned in slightly. "And what did you see?" "A man. Crouched, wearing dark trousers. Couldn't see the face. He must have heard me because he shut the door right quick. I thought I'd dreamt it until I saw the hymn book wasn't mine." "Not yours." Edwin shook his head. It had no number on the spine, and there was writing in the front bit. Purbright exchanged a look with Love. What kind of writing? Don't know. Looked like names. In pencil, but the paper smelled funny, like when Dad's doing the car brakes. Could you read any of the names? The boy frowned, closing one eye. One had a debut, Wilkinson or Wilcox or something, and another with a B. Maybe Beatrix? Purbright gave a faint nod. You've done very well, Edwin. He rose slowly and motioned for Love to follow him outside. A decoy hymnal, Love muttered. Planted, almost certainly, and not by a child. They reached the churchyard again, just as Miss Tiddy, Flaxborough's town librarian and self-appointed keeper of moral order, was scolding a spaniel that had dared defile the war memorial with its hindquarters. You see what happens when young men are raised on jazz and spaghetti, she snapped to no one in particular. No decorum, no dignity. From her came the next bit of gossip. Well, I've heard it from Mrs. Teasdale, and she heard it from the baker's girl. Someone was seen leaving the church at 8:15 this morning, a tall figure in a hat. Not the vicar. Purbright turned toward her. Did your source mention which direction they went? Toward the allotments, apparently. Which is odd, because the Reverend doesn't keep one. Love was already scribbling. Reckon it's the same man? Quite possibly. It was then that a voice piped up behind them. Inspector, you'd best come to the green room. This summons came from Mrs. Maureen Bratley, the church's theatrical coordinator and director of the upcoming Easter pageant, which was meant to involve several angels, one donkey, papier-mâché, and the dramatic reenactment of the second epistle of Paul to Timothy. The cleaners found something behind the props cupboard, said it's not hers, and it's certainly not one of our wings. The green room, tucked behind the parish hall, was a clutter of costume bins, old props, rolled-up banners, and crates marked, Lent, do not touch. The cleaner, a tight-lipped woman with arms like pump handles, pointed to a heap of crumpled cloth beneath a velvet angel robe. Purbright crouched, lifted the fabric. It was a dark coat, tweed, elbow patches worn thin, no tag, but in one pocket, carefully folded, was a torn corner of paper with a church inventory list, dated 2 years prior. Could have been anyone's, Love said doubtfully. Old props? Purbright didn't reply. Instead, he examined the inside lining. There, stitched into the hem, was a faded laundry mark, W.C. Bayton. Love's brows shot up. Wilton Charles Bayton. That's the solicitor who retired to Westbourne Crescent last year, isn't it? Indeed, Purbright said softly. Not someone you'd expect behind a vestry cupboard at 8:30 on a Sunday. They returned to the vicarage to make discreet inquiries, and by mid-afternoon had confirmation. Mr. Bayton had been seen entering the church grounds just after sunrise by Mrs. Tattershaw, who'd been out turning her compost. He had that funny limp, she said. Looked about in a rush, wore gloves too. Very odd for August. Purbright asked whether she had mentioned this to anyone else. Oh no, Inspector, I'm not one to gossip. Love, to his credit, did not choke. By the time they returned to the station, the facts, scattered, contradictory, but persistent, had begun to form a vague perimeter. A hymnal was tampered with, a child misled, a coat abandoned, a retired solicitor seen behaving oddly, possibly implicated, and, stitched quietly through it all, the faint melody of hymn 305, Let Not the Watchman Sleep. Purbright poured himself a tepid cup of station tea and stirred it without drinking. We'll pay Mr. Bayton a visit in the morning, he said at last. I should like to ask what brought him to church before the choir arrived. Love looked up. And if he was the man in the cupboard, Purbright allowed himself a faint smile, then he's going to have an unusually difficult time explaining what he was watching for. The brass bell above Bayton's front door gave a reluctant jangle as Purbright pressed the knocker. Westbourne Crescent was the sort of street where hedges were trimmed to the same height as the occupant's discretion. no higher than the shoulder and never low enough to allow peeking. The solicitor's home was a modest semi-detached with curtains drawn tight despite the morning sun. "I don't like to presume," murmured Sergeant Love, rocking on his heels, "but if I were hiding in a vestry cupboard before breakfast, I'd be sleeping this morning off." Before Purbright could comment, the door opened. Wilton Charles Baton stood before them in slippers and a dressing gown with a brocade collar. His hair, silver and combed with the precision of a retired man unaccustomed to interruption, framed a face of remarkable blandness. Only the eyes seemed incongruous, restless, too alert for a man barely out of bed. "Inspector Purbright," Baton said without being introduced. "And Sergeant Love, is it? Do come in. I thought someone might arrive today." Purbright raised an eyebrow but followed him inside without remark. The hallway was lined with dusty legal tomes and an umbrella stand that appeared to contain a ceremonial mace. They were led into a sitting room that smelled faintly of linseed oil and mothballs. "I assume," Baton began once seated, "this is about yesterday's church disturbance." Purbright inclined his head. "The matter of the choirboy, yes, and the circumstances surrounding a certain hymnal." Baton folded his hands. "Regrettable business. I do hope the boy's recovering." "He is, but he was rather shaken by what he claims to have seen. A man, crouched in the vestry cupboard. A coat matching yours was found shortly afterward behind the church props." Love cleared his throat. "With your name stitched in it." Baton sighed with all the drama of a man reluctantly submitting to tedious inconvenience. "I see. Well, I won't insult your intelligence. I was at the church, but not for mischief. I had an arrangement with the vicar." Purbright's tone remained courteous. "Would you elaborate?" Baton stood and walked to the mantelpiece. "We were working on a small project together. The vicar is compiling a historical record of the parish, land titles, funeral documents, burial sites. He asked for my assistance in checking legal discrepancies. Quiet work, best done in the early hours, undisturbed." Love blinked. "In a vestry cupboard?" Baton gave a tight smile. "I was sorting through older parish registers stored there. The cupboard is awkward but secure. The hymnal in question must have been misplaced amidst the older documents. I did not notice it at the time." Purbright watched him for a long moment. "You didn't inform the vicar you'd be there Sunday morning?" "I had intended to, but I left him a note Saturday evening and assumed he'd read it." "No such note has been found." Baton paused. "Then perhaps it was overlooked. I assure you I meant no harm." Purbright's gaze dropped to the table where a glass ashtray sat beside a folded church newsletter. On its corner was a faint graphite smudge, erased words, barely legible. "Number 7 hymn, B list, inside cover." He nodded faintly and rose. "Thank you, Mr. Baton. We may have further questions later." Outside, Love was quick to speak. "He's hiding something. That story's got more dust on it than the church bell rope." Purbright agreed with a quiet, They were halfway down the street when a panting figure intercepted them. So Miss Fortescue, the choir master's sister, emerged with the posture of a woman who had never in her life chased anything except perhaps a library fine. "Inspector, I must speak with you at once. It's about the hymnals." She produced a slim ledger, bound in green leather with precise annotations. "I've kept a private list for years to discourage the boys from vandalizing them. Number 7 was last signed out 3 weeks ago by a visiting clergyman, Reverend Basil Bentwhistle." Love blinked. "Bentwhistle? That's not a local name." "No, indeed. From Frambourne. He came to deliver a guest sermon, returned the hymnal afterward, but I noted something unusual about it." She opened the ledger to a marked page and pointed. The spine was slightly split. "I intended to report it for repair, but it vanished the following Sunday. And now this." Purbright accepted the ledger, examining her tidy script. "Did Reverend Peeling mention this?" "I told him, of course. but he seemed distracted. Purbright tucked the book under his arm. "Thank you, Miss Fortescue. You've been very helpful." That afternoon brought the week's first council committee meeting. As chance, or fate, would have it, Reverend Peeling was to present on proposed churchyard renovations. The town hall's main chamber was already simmering with mutters as Purbright and Love slipped into the back row. "And furthermore," Alderman Grueley was saying, "I find it frankly indecent to suggest we install rose trellises around gravestones. This isn't a picture postcard." The Reverend, flustered but composed, turned pages at the lectern. "Merely a suggestion from the Historical Preservation Committee. It need not be implemented." Purbright leaned to Love. "Keep your eyes on the vicar when the hymnal's mentioned." But the opportunity arrived sooner. A note was handed to Peeling, who read it, paled, and abruptly excused himself. Minutes later, in the corridor, Purbright intercepted him. "Another surprise, Reverend?" Peeling's lips twitched. "A note, left in my study. I don't know who by." He handed it over. A single sentence, typed on an old machine. "If you continue to dig in old books, you'll find more than dust." Love exhaled. A threat. Purbright turned it over. Nothing on the reverse. "And someone went to the trouble of finding a typewriter," he said softly. "This is no schoolboy prank." The tone shifted. Something, deeper, older than stolen hymnals or fainting boys, had begun to press against the story's edges. And somewhere in Flaxborough, a very quiet watchman was no longer sleeping. The typed note, now sealed in an evidence envelope and tucked into Purbright's satchel, had introduced an element not often seen in Flaxborough affairs: malice. One might expect scheming over allotment boundaries or quiet maneuvers in the bridge club elections, but veiled threats typed on aging machinery. That felt altogether less domestic. Back at the station, Sergeant Love placed the evidence bag on the table as though it might hum or explode. "I reckon that's someone trying to scare the vicar off." "Quite," Purbright replied mildly, removing his coat. "The question is, from what?" He sat, fingers steepled, while Love stood near the radiator and glanced repeatedly at the note as if willing it to sprout a signature. "Could it be about that register business?" Love asked. "The land records and such?" "It's possible," Purbright said, "but there's another thread we mustn't lose. The hymnal." He reached for the church ledger Miss Fortescue had handed over, flipping to the entry for Reverend Bent Whistle. A curious name and a curious man, it now seemed. A phone call to Frambourne Parish confirmed the Reverend had not returned the hymnal after all. He'd left abruptly, citing pastoral exhaustion, and had not been seen since. "Vanished?" Love said, frowning. "Vicars don't vanish. They take sabbaticals or retire to places with soup luncheons and electric blankets." "And yet," Purbright murmured, "his hymnal reappears here, stripped of its label and placed in young Edwin's hands." A knock at the station door interrupted them. Constable Riddle entered, sheepish as always, holding a clear plastic pouch. "This was handed in at the charity shop this morning, sir. Manager said a woman dropped it off in a bag with old books. Didn't give her name, but she left in a hurry." Inside the pouch was a small green-bound hymnal. Number 7, though the sticker was half peeled, and the inner front cover bore faded erasure marks. Purbright removed the book and opened it carefully. Tucked inside was a page torn from a foolscap notebook. On it were scribbled 10 names, each beside a date. 3 names had crosses next to them. One had been underlined, W.C. Bayton. Love read over his shoulder. "This some sort of list?" "More than that," Purbright said. "This is a reckoning." There was no clue to the author, but one detail stood out. At the bottom of the page, in the same pencil, was a faint scrawl. 305. Purbright closed the hymnal slowly. "We must find the others on this list, or what's left of them." They started with the underlined name. A return visit to Mr. Baton's home revealed drawn blinds and a garden hose still dripping into a half-filled watering can. The solicitor was gone. A neighbour, one Mrs. Dunnacliffe, offered little more than a squint and a curl of her upper lip. "He left not an hour ago, Inspector. Car packed full. Said he was heading to Dorset." Very sudden, I thought. Asked if I wanted his old hedge trimmer. I didn't. Love made a note. "Shall I wire the Dorset Constabulary?" "Do," Purbright said, "and request they keep an eye out for a man arriving in a hurry." Of the other names on the list, 3 belonged to residents no longer in Flaxborough. One had died the previous year, natural causes, supposedly. Another had moved to Portugal. The third, an elderly woman named Beatrix Olney, lived in the East End almshouses and had not received visitors in months. They found her seated beside a potted geranium, knitting a blanket of such lurid colours that it seemed less a comfort and more a challenge to the viewer. "Oh yes," she said, peering through glasses thick as jam jars. "I know that hymnal. Basil had it. Always made notes in his books. Said he was keeping track." "Of what?" Purbright asked. "Old sins, I think," she said with a little shrug. "He fancied himself a bit of a crusader." Love scratched his head. "Sins. Discrepancies," she clarified. "Land deeds, unreported marriages, missing entries in the burial register. He told me he was compiling a ledger of people who'd profited from omissions." Purbright's eyes narrowed slightly. "Omissions that might be corrected now." "Oh, he wasn't threatening anyone," she said with a chuckle. "Just made little notes. I think he hoped one day to reveal it all at a sermon. A moral lesson, that sort of thing." "And the hymnal?" "He left it here once. Must have picked it back up. But I remember because of the smell, odd, sharp, like something metallic." Purbright exchanged a glance with Love. "Thank you, Miss Olney. You've been very helpful." As they exited the almshouse, Love said, "So Reverend Bent Whistle uncovers some dodgy dealings, makes a list, hides it in a hymnal, then disappears?" "Not quite," Purbright replied. "He returned to Flaxborough, if only briefly. That hymnal didn't walk into Edwin's hands on its own." They reached the pavement just as a light drizzle began to descend, softening the outlines of the town in mist. The church bells rang midday, low and unhurried. Purbright paused beneath a hanging pub sign and looked up at the slate sky. "We need to know," he said, "who else stood to lose if that hymnal was seen, and who had reason to frighten the vicar into silence." Love nodded. "You think someone planted it deliberately?" "I think," Purbright said, "that the boy wasn't meant to faint. He was meant to run, cause a stir, and in the flurry the hymnal would vanish again. But he didn't." "No," Purbright said. "He was braver than they expected." By Wednesday morning, Flaxborough was buzzing louder than the church's wasp-prone organ loft. A curious article had appeared in the Courier, penned in the passive-aggressive style of its junior reporter, one Myrtle Tonks. Anonymous sources stir memories of lost parish ledger. Allegations of historical irregularities resurface amid choirboy mishap. The photo beneath showed Edwin looking understandably baffled, his choir robes rumpled and his socks mismatched. The headline alone was enough to put every kettle in the town to a boil. Purbright read it over toast at his desk, spreading marmalade. With the same slow patience he applied to suspects. "Who fed Myrtle that story?" asked Love, arriving with the post. "She wasn't there Sunday, and she'd sooner write about geranium theft than anything ecclesiastical." "Someone wants the story to spread," Purbright said. "But carefully. Stir suspicion without naming names. Classic distraction." Among the mail was a plain envelope, unmarked except for a single stamp and no return address. Inside was a clipping from an older edition of the Courier, dated 12 years prior. A grainy photo showed a younger Reverend Peeling standing beside a scaffolding structure with 3 other men. The headline read, St. Ethelburga's crypt repairs uncover medieval tombs. Scrawled across the clipping in red pen. That's when it started. Love looked over his shoulder. What started? We'll find out, Purbright murmured. But I think it's time we examined those church records in person. They returned to the vestry, requesting access to the full parish archive. Reverend Peeling, looking increasingly frayed at the collar, obliged with shaking hands. You'll find them in the crypt chamber beneath the tower. We keep the older ledgers in sealed boxes. I haven't looked at them in years. Love carried a torch and a folding stool. Purbright brought nothing but a notepad and a mild frown. The stone steps to the crypt were steep, and the air grew cooler with each turn. The room at the bottom smelled of dust, candle grease, and something older, lime and age. Wooden boxes, marked in fading ink, lined the walls. They began sorting. Some boxes contained rosters of births and deaths, others financial records for the church's maintenance. It was in the 6th box that they found something curious. A gap in the sequence of burial permits between 1962 and 1966. 4 years missing entirely. Purbright frowned. Odd. This should be the period Baton served as parish trustee. Love was leafing through another file. And look here. Land transfer papers for a parcel near the West Cemetery gate. Signed only by one witness, when 2 were standard by that date. Purbright turned the permit over. And no registry entry for the transfer in the county record either. Love looked up. Someone sold off church land without documentation? Or someone acquired land that wasn't theirs to sell, Purbright said, and our reverend may have been too green to notice or too frightened to ask. As they emerged from the crypt, the sound of raised voices filtered down from the hall above. They hurried up to find a row of townspeople standing in a semicircle around the lectern. At its center, red-faced and gesturing wildly, was Mrs. Goodbar, president of the Flaxborough Floral Committee. "I demand a full audit of church property," she cried, "and of all council documents related to it. These rumors must be answered." Behind her, Alderman Grueley, sweating profusely and fiddling with his chain of office, tried to calm her. Now, Geraldine, there's no need for all this rabble-rousing." "Oh, there's every need," she snapped. "That crypt is practically a municipal secret. And what about the money from the rose window restoration? We've had that scaffolding up since Pentecost." Purbright stepped forward. "Is this a scheduled meeting?" "No," said Grueley, clearly relieved by the interruption. "It's an unsanctioned gathering, a spontaneous, concerned citizens forum." Love whispered. "Feels like set-piece event number 1. The crowd was growing now, fueled by gossip and the irresistible pull of civic scandal. Then it happened. A loud crash echoed through the nave. People spun round to see a figure dart from the side corridor near the organ loft, knocking over a folding table covered in tea urns and biscuit tins. Purbright moved fast, cutting across the pews. Love went wide, flanking toward the vestry. They caught only a glimpse. Tweed coat, cap pulled low, dark gloves. The figure vanished into the tower stairwell. Love reached the doorway a beat too late. Gone, must have slipped out the south entrance. Purbright turned to inspect what had been dropped. Amid the fallen mugs and ginger snaps was a manila envelope. Inside, a single page from the missing parish record, dated 1964. It bore a list of interments in the old crypt. One entry was circled in blue crayon. Thomas Yule, aged 47. Cause of death, unknown. Burial approved by W.C. Baton. Love read it and whistled. That name again. Buried in the crypt, but never registered properly. Purbright stared at the circled name. "And now someone wants us to find him." The church bells tolled the hour. Noon again. But it rang less like a summons to prayer and more like a warning. By late afternoon, a light fog had crept across Flaxborough, blurring the corners of its half-timbered houses and dampening the mood of its more vocal citizens. But gossip, like mildew, clings best in wet weather. Outside the co-op, two pensioners with curlers and folded arms were dissecting the church incident in great detail. "I heard they found a coffin with no name on it," said one. "More likely a stash of money, or skeletons of old lovers. That sort of thing always ends up in the church crypt." "Well, it wouldn't surprise me. They never did explain why the flower show funds went missing in '68. In the constabulary's upstairs records room, Purbright was poring over historical maps. One from 1959 showed the old St. Ethelburga's layout prior to the post-war renovations. Another from 1965 bore several hand-drawn annotations, most of them in Baton's distinctive legal scrawl. He tapped a finger on a shaded section just behind the organ chamber. "There," he said. "That passage, walled off after the repairs. No record of what was done with the original access point." Love leaned in, munching absently on a toffee. "You think the passage leads to the crypt?" "Or past it," Purbright replied. "And if someone has been using it recently, it may explain the sudden appearances and disappearances." There was a knock on the glass. Constable Riddle stood with an expression somewhere between discomfort and urgency. "Sir, you're wanted at the parish hall." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Another committee ambush?" "Not quite, sir. There's been an incident." When they arrived, the parish hall foyer was a scatter of upended chairs, broken pottery, and spilled flour. At the center stood Mrs. Bratley, hands still dusted with cake mix and trembling slightly. "I was rehearsing the resurrection tableau," she explained, "when we heard something below. A crash. One of the children swears they saw a shadow move behind the curtain. I opened the prop cupboard and, well, this fell out." She pointed to a battered leather satchel now sitting on the table, its clasp broken and its contents half spilled. A stack of papers, a rusted key, and a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles. Purbright opened the top folder carefully. Inside were letters, mostly typed on church stationery. Each bore the signature of Wilton Charles Baton. Several were addressed to Reverend Peeling. The earliest was dated 1964. "Dear Reverend, further to our discussion regarding the disputed ledger entries, I must reiterate that drawing public attention to the missing names will bring unnecessary distress. Better, I think, to let sleeping matters lie. Yours in trust, W.C. Baton Love," exhaled. That doesn't sound like a man interested in transparency. Purbright continued sifting until he reached a handwritten note, far newer in appearance. "The key unlocks the vestry vault, beneath the second step. If you are reading this, it means I couldn't keep them away any longer." The writing was shaky, the ink smudged. It was unsigned. "Who found this?" Purbright asked. Mrs. Bratley pointed to a small boy in an angel costume near the biscuit table. "Albert did. Said it bonked him on the head when he opened the bottom drawer." Albert gave a shy nod. "It was behind the donkey legs." The rusted key was examined and pocketed. "That vault," Love said slowly. "You think it's still accessible?" "We'll find out," said Purbright. They returned to St. Ethelburga's as evening closed in. The fog was thicker now, softening the lamplight and giving the church an almost spectral glow. In the vestry, they pried at the second step until a hidden panel gave way with a reluctant groan. Beneath it, set into the stone, was a narrow iron lock plate. The rusted key turned with difficulty. A hidden cavity opened, just wide enough for a hand. Purbright reached in slowly and withdrew a parcel wrapped in oilcloth. Inside, another green hymnal, number 7, but this one was different. On the inner cover was a list of names. The same as before. But now, next to each, were updated notes in red ink, dates, addresses, and, next to 3 names, the word silenced. Love read it twice. "You think someone's keeping score?" Purbright nodded grimly. Bentwhistle didn't just uncover irregularities. He was documenting them as leverage. And someone's been trying to erase that leverage piece by piece. Purbright held up the spectacles from the satchel. Gold-rimmed, slightly bent. Love tilted his head. Belonged to Baton? Possibly. But there's a faint engraving on the arm. See? They peered closer. B.B. Love blinked. Bent whistle. Then that satchel belonged to him, not Baton. Meaning? Purbright said slowly. He was here longer than anyone admitted. Possibly watching. Possibly being watched. The fog outside pressed against the stained glass like breath on cold glass. Somewhere beyond, a bell chimed 5:30. Purbright stood, hymnal in one hand, spectacles in the other. We're not chasing a missing document anymore, Sergeant. No, sir. We're chasing a motive someone is still willing to protect. Quietly. Or violently. It was after dark when Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love returned to the station, the hymnal and spectacles carefully sealed in evidence pouches and placed inside the secure cabinet. The fog had not lifted. It clung to the lamp-posts like cobwebs and rolled across Market Street with theatrical persistence. Purbright poured himself a cup of lukewarm tea and stood by the window, watching the hazy glow of the gaslight blur across the panes. Love paced behind him, restless. There's something that doesn't sit right, Love said finally. If Bent Whistle was in town long enough to leave his satchel, his key, his notes, why didn't anyone see him? Someone did, Purbright replied. But either they didn't realize it was him, or they didn't want to admit it. Love frowned. You think they're hiding it deliberately? Purbright turned. At least one person is. Possibly more. And those notes, silenced, they're not the work of a cleric airing grievances. They're the work of someone keeping score, which begs the question, whose ledger is this really? He reached for the list again. 9 names in total. 3 crossed off. Baton underlined. 2 names were familiar from earlier research, but one, circled faintly in pencil, stood out. Miriam Ewell. Miriam Ewell, Love repeated. That's the same surname as the crypt burial. Thomas Ewell. And the same address, according to the 1957 parish register. Purbright pulled out a typed sheet. No longer in town. She moved to a small cottage in Goresby Green a few years ago. Lives under her maiden name now. Shall we pay her a visit? Tomorrow, Purbright said. I'd like to verify something first. That night, Purbright took a quiet walk through the empty town centre, ending at the locked gates of the churchyard. He stood for some minutes, staring at the mist-shrouded silhouette of St. Ethelburga's. No movement, but a sense of expectancy lingered, like the moment before a page is turned. At precisely 8 the next morning, he and Love were on the road to Goresby Green, a 10-minute drive out of town, where the fog was thinner and the hedges shaggier. Miriam Ewell's cottage was a low, whitewashed affair with a bright blue door and rows of potted marigolds along the wall. A bird cage hung by the window, empty except for an old bell on a string. She opened the door wearing a shawl and a faint air of defiance. Her eyes, sharp and appraising, landed first on Purbright, then on the police car, then on the evidence pouch tucked beneath his arm. I was wondering how long it would take, she said, stepping aside. Come in, I've got tea, strong. They followed her into a neat sitting room filled with crocheted doilies and the smell of lavender polish. You're here about Thomas, she said without preamble. Purbright nodded. You were his wife? Until 1963, she said. Then I was his widow. Her voice carried no sorrow, only the crisp clarity of a woman who had long outlived scandal. Your husband's name appears on a parish document, Purbright said. Buried in the crypt, cause of death listed as unknown, no registry entry, and now someone's taken steps to draw attention to it. Miriam poured the tea. Not someone. Me. Love blinked. You planted the envelope. No, but I did keep a copy of the original ledger page. I suspected it might resurface one day. I didn't know someone else was also poking about. Perhaps that clergyman, Bent Whistle, was it? I never met him. Purbright took a slow sip. May I ask how your husband died? Miriam sat straighter. He collapsed in the church one afternoon. They said it was his heart, but he wasn't buried with the others. Baton insisted it had to be quiet. Said there were legal irregularities. He handled everything privately. Why? I never found out. But after Thomas died, Baton visited me once. He brought a check, told me to forget what I'd heard in the vestry that day. What had you heard? A conversation, she said simply. Baton and a man I didn't recognize. They were arguing about property, land near the western wall, something about moving a boundary stone without church permission, which could explain the missing records. She nodded. I tried once to speak to the vicar. He was new then, just starting out, but he said the matter had been settled with the Lord. That was his phrase. Love looked pained. And you didn't press it? I was a young widow, Sergeant, and Flaxborough's memory is selective. Purbright leaned forward. Why the sudden interest now? Because I'm dying, she said without flinching, and I refuse to let those men be remembered as anything but what they were. I've already written to the diocesan council, enclosed everything I've kept, even the list. Purbright looked at her carefully. Then you must also know that someone has tried to suppress that list. She nodded. Yes, and I'm not surprised. That sort of rot doesn't die quietly. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the birdcage gently against the frame. I'll give you names, Miriam said, but you must be careful. There are still people who will protect the old ways. People who believe what was done for the good of the parish. And what do you believe? Purbright asked. I believe the dead have no interest in good reputations, she said. Only in being remembered. The drive back from Goresby Green was silent for the first few miles. Even Sergeant Love, usually inclined to fill the air with speculation or second-hand anecdotes, remained unusually contemplative, staring out the window as hedgerows flicked past like unspooled ribbon. It was Purbright who spoke first. She didn't flinch when she said it. Not once. No, Love agreed, and she didn't try to protect anyone either. Most folks try to soften it. Say he meant well, or times were different. She didn't bother. She's waited decades for the truth to matter. Now she wants it to count for something. The mood in the constabulary was no brighter. Constable Riddle had returned from the county archives with a few photocopied pages, one of which bore a familiar name, Thomas Yule, deceased. Body not registered in County Cemetery Index. Private church interment noted by hand. Purbright read it once, then again. A handwritten note in the margin, likely by a junior clerk, read, Query, jurisdiction, not followed up. It's the missing step, he said. Baton engineered a bypass of the formal registry, with Peeling too new to challenge it and no one else willing to question a solicitor's authority. It went unexamined. Love pointed to the date on the side. Same week as the Rose Window appeal. Church was preoccupied. And the press focused on the renovation, not the records, Purbright added. Neatly done. Just then, a call came through from the parish clerk. There's been another envelope, Riddle reported, returning with a fresh brown pouch. Found this morning tucked into the collection box, marked for the inspector's eyes only. Inside was a folded sheet of hotel stationery from the Sanderling Arms, the handwriting in a neat, slanted hand. There is more beneath the choir, beneath the floorboards, not the crypt, the chamber where the children rehearse. B.B. Love let out a breath. Bent Whistle again? Could he have hidden something there before disappearing? Or someone wants us to believe that, Purbright said. But we follow the lead regardless. The choir chamber was a small room at the base of the bell tower, now used mostly for music rehearsals and organ-tuning complaints. It smelled of varnish and stale hymn sheets. The floor was ancient oak, varnished and uneven. One corner bore scrape marks, barely noticeable except to a trained eye. Purbright knelt and examined the seam. "Get me that screwdriver from the vestry toolkit." Love returned moments later, and together they pried up one panel. Beneath it, a narrow cavity revealed a cloth-bound ledger wrapped in oilcloth. It smelled of mildew and ink. Carefully, Purbright opened it. The entries were meticulous, each one a different name from the original list, with detailed notations. But there was more. Across the top of the first page, written in large red letters, were the words, "Churchlands Trust, Undeclared Holdings." Love blinked. "It's a property ledger." "More than that," Purbright said. "It's a map of every parcel that was ever misappropriated from churchland, sold without notice, transferred to trustees, rented back to the council at inflated rates. And all connected to Bayton. Bayton, and at least 2 others. Look, this one's signed by Gruely." "Gruely?" Love gaped. "The alderman." Purbright flipped through pages. "And this one here, initials only. EP could be Reverend Peeling." Love's voice dropped. "You think the vicar was in on it?" "If he wasn't in from the start, he's been helping keep it buried," Purbright said. "Either way, it explains why someone's been trying to frighten him off the scent." He snapped the book shut. "We have what we need. Now we see what happens when the town learns what their Rose Window Fund really bought." By late afternoon, the mayor had been informed. An emergency meeting was scheduled for the following evening at the town assembly rooms, a public one. Purbright had barely returned to his office when the telephone rang. It was the hospital. "Mr. Bayton has turned up, checked himself into the private wing, nervous exhaustion, says he's been followed for days, refuses to see anyone but you." Love looked up. "Well, there's your guilty conscience." "Perhaps," Purbright said, "or something else. Either way, we pay him a visit. Now." At the hospital, Bayton looked thinner. The bags under his eyes were deeper, and his voice had the tremble of a man who'd been watching doorways too long. "You found the ledger?" he asked. "We did," he nodded. "I knew it wouldn't stay buried. Not forever. You had plenty of chances to come clean. I thought I was protecting the church, the town, myself. And now?" Bayton looked up, his eyes surprisingly clear. "Now I'm just trying to live with what I didn't stop." Purbright leaned forward. "Who else signed those deals?" Bayton hesitated. "Gruely and one other, but he didn't sign anything. He orchestrated it, promised it would all balance out in the end." "Name?" Bayton swallowed. "Peeling. But you have to understand, he thought he was saving the parish." Love shook his head. "They always do." Purbright rose. "Tomorrow night the town will hear it all. Be prepared to answer for your part." Bayton gave a faint nod, but his eyes had already drifted to the window. Outside, the mist had returned, swallowing the lights of Flaxborough in its quiet, relentless way. The assembly rooms were already 3/4 full by the time Inspector Purbright arrived, the air thick with anticipation and over-applied lavender water. Rows of wooden chairs creaked under the weight of pensioners, committee secretaries, amateur historians, and those whose only real interest lay in hearing their own gasps of indignation at regular intervals. The meeting was not due to begin for another 20 minutes, but the murmurs had already reached a level of nervous energy more typical of bingo night with a malfunctioning microphone. Sergeant Love stood near the entrance, notebook in hand, giving discreet nods to familiar faces. Mrs. Goodbar had arrived in full floral regalia, her notebook bristling with color-coded tabs. Alderman Gruely sat at the head table, visibly sweating into the collar of his civic robe. Reverend Peeling had not yet appeared. Purbright approached the stage and placed a sealed folder on the lectern. It contained photocopies of the hymnal list, the property ledger, and selected correspondence from Baton's satchel. He adjusted the microphone, tapped it once, not for effect, but habit, and then returned to his chair. Love joined him. "Think they'll sit quietly?" "They'll simmer," Purbright said. "But once the names start, simmering won't be an option." At precisely 7 o'clock, the mayor called the meeting to order with the usual platitudes about transparency, concern for historical stewardship, and the importance of community spirit. None of it reached the back row, where Miss Fortescue sat knitting in a rhythm that suggested judgment with every stitch. Purbright was invited to speak. He took the podium without fanfare and opened the folder. "There is," he began, "a long-standing assumption in Flaxborough that what lies beneath its surface, be it earth or history, is best left undisturbed. That, I'm afraid, is no longer an option." He outlined the findings without embellishment. The misappropriated church lands, the falsified registers, the private burials, including that of Thomas Yule, the second hymnal, and the notes it contained. At the mention of Gruely's signature, a collective intake of breath swept the room. Gruely himself looked as though he had swallowed a particularly aggressive mint. "But perhaps most significantly," Purbright continued, "we have a signed statement from Mr. Wilton Baton, confirming that certain transfers were made under direct encouragement from a third party." He paused. "That person, now revealed, is Reverend Edmund Peeling." There was a gasp, sharp, almost theatrical. The doors at the back opened just then, and Peeling entered, pale and breathless, a man either running late or running scared. Every head turned. He stopped halfway down the aisle, blinking at the assembled faces, before turning his eyes to Purbright. "I didn't mean for any of it to happen," he said, his voice strangely clear. "They said it would help the church, that the land was unused, that the money would go to repairs." Gruely stood up abruptly. "This is slander. You have no authority to accuse an elected official." Purbright looked at him with measured calm. "We have documentation, Alderman, signatures, ledger entries, and more than one witness." Murmurs erupted across the room. Mrs. Bratley stood up, visibly trembling. "Is that why the flower fund went missing and the bell tower never got its insulation? Because you were using church money to plug your own schemes?" Gruely's face reddened. "This is a witch hunt." But the crowd no longer belonged to him. Peeling stepped forward again. "I tried to stop it. When Bent Whistle returned, he found the records. He threatened to expose us. That's why I panicked. I let Baton hide the hymnal, said nothing when the boy found it." Love stepped in now, calm but firm. "So you knew it was being planted?" Peeling gave a hopeless nod. "We thought no one would believe the boy, that it would all pass quietly." A sharp voice cut through the tension. "Miss Tiddy, from the Historical Society. And what of Thomas Yule? Who spoke for him?" The room fell silent. Purbright returned to the lectern. "That is why we are here, so that finally someone does speak for him, and for all those whose names were buried as deeply as their bodies." The mayor cleared his throat. "In light of this revelation, I propose we adjourn until the council can formally investigate." But before he could finish, the lights flickered. There was a thud from the hallway. A door slammed. Purbright was already moving, Love behind him. Outside, the corridor was empty, but a side exit stood ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. A faint scuff on the floor, a streak of mud, fresh, led away toward the rear gate. Love muttered, "Someone's bolted." "They were watching," Purbright said. "Listening. Perhaps the one name we haven't yet uncovered." They reached the gate, but the alley was empty. Fog again. The same dense curtain as before. Only this time it didn't feel like it came from the sea. It felt like it came from someone's lungs. The fog hung low over the rooftops of Flaxborough the next morning, not so much dispersing as settling in, as if the town itself had chosen to exhale and wait. The street outside the police station was quieter than usual for a Friday. Shop shutters opened late. A few loitering pensioners stood by the war memorial, trading whispers in tones that were more reverent than gossipy. Inside, Inspector Purbright sat at his desk, with the hymnal open before him, its spine still fragile, the ink still sharp. The red marks had dried into permanence, names underlined with a finality that no town meeting could soften. Sergeant Love sat opposite, sipping black tea that had long since gone cold. "Well," Love said, half to the room, half to himself. "We found our names, got the confession, dusted off the ledger." Purbright looked up. "But someone still ran." Love nodded. "Someone not on the list." Purbright turned the hymnal slowly. Someone who knew the whole time, close enough to slip into vestries, plant hymnals, collect satchels. Not baitin', not peeling. Someone quieter. A soft knock at the door. Constable Riddle entered, holding a file. "Post just came in, sir. There's this." He handed over a brown envelope, unmarked except for a simple handwritten line across the front. "For Mr. Yule." Purbright frowned. Strange. Inside was a single sheet. On it, typed in precise alignment, was the following: "Thomas Yule was my friend. He trusted the wrong men, and I helped bury his name for the sake of the parish's reputation. No more. Let him be seen. Let the church remember." It was unsigned. But the stationery bore the crest of St. Ethelburga's. Love leaned forward. "You think the runner sent this?" Purbright didn't answer. Instead, he retrieved the original inventory of the church's vestry volunteers from 1964, the same year as Yule's death. At the bottom was a familiar name, Harold Coggins, the verger. Love blinked. "Coggins? But he's been around for years, always polishing, always in the background." "Exactly," Purbright murmured. "The perfect position. No one notices the one who dusts the hymn boards." They made their way to St. Ethelburga's without ceremony. The door was already ajar. Inside, the nave was empty save for Coggins, polishing the brass lectern with the slow, circular movements of someone used to long silences. He looked up as they entered. Not startled, expectant. I wondered how long it would take. Purbright approached with measured steps. "You were there the morning Edwin found the hymnal." "I put it there," Coggins said simply, "but not out of malice. I thought, if someone found it, perhaps it would be enough. To begin again. To clear his name. You helped Baton." "Not at first. I tried to warn him off. But after Yule died, after they put him down there like a crate of old hymnals, I couldn't stomach it. I kept copies. Bentwhistle found me years later. Said he'd tracked it all through the vestry records." Love stared. "But you let him go. Let him vanish." "I thought he'd gone to the diocesan council," Coggins said. "He said he would, but then I heard nothing. I thought he'd been removed." "You've had every opportunity to speak." "I'm a verger, Inspector. I keep order, sweep dust, not raise voices." Purbright studied him. "But someone threatened peeling, planted the typewritten notes." "I did. To push him. To make him tell the truth." Love looked skeptical. "You were playing both sides?" "I was trying," Coggins said, "to do what the vicar should have done decades ago." Purbright looked at the man for a long moment. "And now?" Coggins sighed. "I'll resign, of course. There'll be inquiries. Probably press." "There will," Purbright said. "But perhaps also clarity." Outside, the fog was finally lifting. Later that day, in a quiet ceremony attended by just 4 people, a temporary plaque was affixed to the inside of St. Ethelburga's crypt. It read, "In memory of Thomas Yule, 1917 to 1963, a faithful servant of the parish." May the truth of his story rest as he does, at peace. Miss Fortescue stood beside it for a long while, head bowed, as if she were inspecting the stitching on eternity itself. By Monday, a fresh hymnal had been placed on the lectern. Number 142. The children had resumed rehearsal. Edwin Tudge, now something of a local celebrity, had developed a flair for dramatic pauses. Reverend Peeling had submitted a letter of resignation. Grueley was on extended leave, and Wilton Bayton remained in the private wing, dictating memoirs to a very patient nurse. And Coggins. He left behind only a note pinned to the vestry door with a polished brass tack. I was the watchman. Too late, perhaps. But I never stopped watching. Purbright read it once, then folded it away. On his walk home that evening, he passed the choir boy's bench where it all began. A fresh hymnal sat neatly on the pew, numbered, aligned, undisturbed. Flaxborough had its scandals, but it also sometimes had its reckonings.